Okay, I think we've got sufficient numbers of participants now to justify making a start. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thanks very much for sharing your time with us this evening. And welcome to the third in our spring series of webinars all about woodland restoration, specifically restoration of ancient and semi-natural woodlands and plantation on ancient natural woodland sites. This evening, I'm delighted to introduce Edward Mills, Forestry Advisor, and coincidentally, I was going to introduce myself as Claire de Villanueva. I've been with Cumbria Woodlands as an associate for 7 years. And in fact, Edward Mills is just celebrating having left Cumbria Woodlands, unrelated, 7 years ago, having been the director of Cumbria Woodlands prior to Neville's predecessor. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to give another introduction to my colleague Angus, who does some work on our PAWS project, all funded by the Woodland Trust. And then I'll let Edward introduce himself and he can give us a presentation. And then after that, we'll have time for some discussions and questions. Should you need to start or stop your video, if you look down at the bottom bar of your Zoom window, there should be a mute button and a stop video. Those are quite important buttons for you to know about. And there's also a chat function. If you want to submit any questions via the chat function or have any other queries, you're welcome to use that. Go ahead. Okay, Angus, would you give us a couple of minutes just on your PAWS work? Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine. Can everyone hear me? With at Cumbria Woodlands, we're doing quite a lot of work, as Claire said, working with and funded by the Woodland Trust. And this takes the sort of form of PAWS assessments and reports for woodland owners. So if you have a woodland and you would like a PAWS assessment, that's something we have been doing, we're continuing to do. And we've also just been distributing some green recovery fund money, and that's also through the Woodland Trust, but that is for actual works in the woodland, such as thinning or even horse logging, things like that. So yes, that's what we're doing at the minute to do with PAWS. I would say that Jamie is the sort of PAWS in charge PAWS person. So yes, he's not here tonight, but he knows a lot about that too.
Thanks, Angus. Yeah, many of you met Jamie at a previous spring series webinar, and I think he's juggling a small child at the moment, so I'm not going to put him on the spot right now. Okay, Edward, would you introduce yourself, and I'll make you the host so that you can share your screen when you're ready.
Okie dokie, thanks very much. Can everybody hear me okay? Great, thanks, thanks Claire. Yes, I'm Edward Mills. I work in the private sector. I'm not sure whether celebrating 7 years leaving Cumbria Woodlands is exactly right, but I think we know what you mean, Claire. So yes, I now work in the private sector, work for myself, but I still do pretty much what I used to do at Cumbria Woodlands, but without the office and the funding applications. So I help people manage their woodlands better. I think that was what what we got up to at Cumbria Woodlands. I write the management plans and help them find contractors and sell timber and organise contracts and all that kind of thing. And in the course of the last 7 years, I've come across a fair amount of rhododendron. So I've had a bit of experience of tackling it. I'm absolutely not the world's sort of rhododendron guru or expert. So it'd be really interesting to have your feedback in due course. So I have a presentation, and I'll I'll share my screen in a sec. Yes, let's share that now.
You should be host now, Edward. It might mean that if we have any latecomers, you might get a flash up on your screen, a message to say so and so's joined the waiting room. If you have the capacity in that moment to press admit, that would be great.
Yep, okay, I'll see what I can do. Try and do that. So I'm just sharing my screen now. Can everybody see that? Yep, brilliant. Okay, so as I say, I'm not the world's expert on this, but I've had a little bit of experience, and I've done a little bit of reading up as well. So Rhododendron Ponticon. It took me a while to find a map of its native range, but I thought that was just quite useful to put it into a bit of context. You know, we're all very familiar with rhododendron, but it's not native to the UK, and you can see from this map of Europe that it's actually native to sort of the shores and a bit inland in Bulgaria there, and Turkey, and around the Black Sea. And there's a few blobs in southern Spain and Portugal as well. But such a long, big distance between those two places that I'm not absolutely convinced it's native in Spain and Portugal. Anyway, it's in Britain. We're a long way from its native home range. Excuse me. But as you all know, it seems to be quite at home here in northwest England. It doesn't mind the climatic conditions at all. It's very happy in high rainfall. It loves the acid soil conditions. It doesn't grow on limestone or chalk soils happily at all, but in acid soils, which is pretty much most of the Lake District, then it's very at home. And it seems to be, although its native range is very much in a sort of southeastern Europe climate where it's warmer and drier, it certainly seems to be completely frost hardy as well. So deep frost it can tolerate very well, except perhaps I've noticed locally when we have really sharp late frosts, its flowers don't like that. So perhaps that's one weak point if it has any. I suspect also it's very tolerant to drought. Obviously, it grows in around the Black Sea in extremely hot summers, and you know its waxy evergreen leaves would indicate that it's very tolerant of drought as well. So this is just a shot of our rhododendron in Eskdale, taken from the Laurati railway. So what are the benefits of rhododendron cover? I thought maybe we should just bring a bit of lightheartedness into this, since it's the evening. Well, what are the benefits? I thought of one. It can provide some shrub layer where there isn't anything else. And sometimes you do find woodlands that are in desperate need of a shrub layer, just a bit of somewhere for birds to find a bit of cover and a bit of nesting habitat, and it does provide that. And you know, I have got rid of rhododendron in woods where it was the only shrub layer, and it certainly does make a wood very bare if there's nothing else. Second and third, no, that's it. Couldn't think of anything else. And apologies to Private Eye, for those of you who read Private Eye magazine, this is an ongoing format that they use. So why should we control Rhododendron Ponticon? Well, it's a non-native. I've said that already. You can see where its native range is, and for some people, the very fact that it's non-native is enough to try and control it. What else? It's very invasive. We'll have a look at that in a minute. And it quickly covers the ground and it shades out native plants. It casts a really deep shade. It's very efficient at gathering the light and cancelling out other plants. For quite a long time, I've been telling people that rhododendron is allelopathic, and you'll find this on the internet if you look it up. When a plant has features of allelopathy, apparently beech is slightly allelopathic, and it has a toxin in the leaves, and when those leaves rot down, they leave a toxin in the soil which inhibits the germination of other plants. And I've been telling people for years that it's allelopathic, and you'll find this on the internet. But I've since discovered at least 2 academic papers that say there is no evidence at all that it's allelopathic. And there aren't toxins in the leaves that inhibit other plants growing. However, you will find that when you clear rhododendron, it takes ages for the ground flora to recover, years and years and years. And it's thought that the plant alters the mycorrhizal makeup in the soil. It changes the fungi that are there, the beneficial fungi. It can also make the pH even more acidic than it already is. So it's probably a combination of things, factors that mean that rhododendron sort of leaves a legacy in the soil, which makes other plants have difficulty to colonize. And also for a number of years, I used to say to people, well, at least it looks pretty and it's great for the bees, isn't it? And people go, oh, yes, it's great for the bees. But if you research this, it is apparently toxic to some species of bees, not all bees. And this is really quite complicated. So I won't go into any detail, not that I know very much detail. So it's toxic to some bees and it makes them lethargic, and that inhibits their foraging ability to gather nectar from other plants. Now, I've also discovered that honey made from high concentration of rhododendron nectar can also be toxic and toxic to people. And this was news to me, but this is I found this fascinating. And apparently, when the Romans were invading that Black Sea area, they knew about this, and they left honey by the roadside for the Roman troops to eat, knowing that it would make the troops lethargic and sleepy and slightly dizzy and not fit for battle. And apparently, this became known as, you heard it here first, folks, mad honey disease. So if you look up mad honey disease, it is a thing. Okay, I bet Neville thought I would never get to this bit, but so rhododendron is the main sporulating host of Phytophthora, and this is otherwise known as larch dieback disease, and you'll find it noted as sudden oak death as well. So this is really serious stuff. And if there are no other reasons to get rid of rhododendron, this is the one you should focus on. And the 6th reason to get rid of it is that, you know, if you're trying to manage a woodland and bring a neglected woodland back into management, a lot of these woods full of rhododendron are neglected. You know, sometimes if the rhododendron's dense, you can't even walk into the wood. You can't see what trees you've got. You certainly can't get anywhere near them to put a pink dot on them if you want to do any thinning or mark out a coop. You just physically can't get in. And if you ask a forwarder driver or a harvester machine driver to go into a wood with rhododendron, they might stick 2 fingers up at you, because, you know, that can be pretty dangerous. You can't see where you're going if there's a bad infestation of rhododendron. So just quickly back to Phytophthora ramorum, larch dieback disease. You can see photos here of rhododendron with Phytophthora. It causes the shoots to wilt. It's almost the only disease that seems to affect rhododendron, funnily enough. And the rhododendron produces an enormous amount of spores, and that then goes on to directly infect larch. And in that bottom left-hand corner, you can see the whole larch forest turning grey and dying in front of your eyes. And just a snapshot, I think, from last year of where this Phytophthora ramorum is found. As you can see, it loves the wet, humid, cloudy, misty west coast, slightly along the south coast there. So it is the high risk zone is mostly in the west of the UK. And here's its wonderfully beautiful flower, and I think there's no doubt about it. They are beautiful, but I think, you know, if you find yourself looking at this and thinking, "Oh, isn't that lovely? Let's just keep one bush," then, you know, you need to remind yourself that each flower can produce up to 5,000 seeds. They're incredibly fine. They're like dust. So a small to medium-sized bush can produce 1 million seeds. That's a lot of potential to spread. And it has incredible powers of layering as well. I should have taken a photo of this, but I haven't. So when the branches, they loop down, and when they touch the ground, they get covered in leaf mold very quickly, and that branch then roots, and you can see these rhododendrons sort of looping across the woodland floor, spreading incredibly quickly and efficiently. If you want to know more about managing and controlling rhododendron, then this is the manual to look at. This is a Forestry Commission practice note. I think this edition is from 2006. I'm not absolutely sure it's been updated since then, but to be honest, I don't think you really need anything apart from this manual. It's quite long. It's 56 pages, so it just goes to show there's quite a lot to think about when you're considering controlling invasive rhododendron. And that's what it looks like inside. That's the kind of thing that it covers. So right from the beginning, prioritizing where to start, choosing the right control techniques, implementing the control techniques, resurveying, seeing how you've done, and the follow-up control as well, which is critically important. So what are the methods of control? Well, usually people, contractors, volunteer owners go in with a chainsaw and they cut it down. And that sounds nice and simple, isn't it? You go in with a saw, cut the growth off at the stump, and then ideally paint the stump straight away with a herbicide. And Roundup is perfectly efficient at the right mixture at killing rhododendron. And stump treatment in the autumn in particular is quite effective. A lot of people add a blue dye to the herbicide so you can see where you've been, because when you're going quickly doing a lot of this stuff, it's quite difficult to know what you've treated unless you can see where you've been. Quite often you'll find that you're controlling rhododendron in a site where somebody's already gone through it with a chainsaw and the growth is quite small and quite young, and using a chainsaw again on that can be an absolute nightmare because you've got hundreds of kind of coppice stems, half an inch or inch thick, and you really don't have anything to get your chainsaw stuck into. And I found, certainly on a small to medium scale, that a pruning saw is just as efficient in that particular situation than a chainsaw. I've put herbicide application as the second method of control, sort of standalone really. Most people go back after they've cut the rhododendron off at the stump. Most people go back and apply herbicide the following year. But of course, sometimes you find that the rhododendron growth is small enough to treat without doing any cutting at all, particularly if it's already been cut in the previous 2 or 3 years. You shouldn't really start spraying herbicide all over the place if it's above kind of chest height really, otherwise the stuff's going everywhere and it's far less controlled, including all over you, which can't be good. I have used contractors with flail machines, and we'll have a look at some photos shortly. And that can be very efficient indeed, particularly on flat sites and sites where you can get one of these really heavy tracked machines. And the theory is that when you flail the regrowth, you're really smashing up the stems and the layers. It makes it almost impossible to treat with herbicide up by stump painting because you can't see them. But the very fact that you're sort of ripping it up and smashing it means that the regrowth is far less vigorous. It really doesn't like that at all. You can extract or control the rhododendron by attaching a winch to an arm of a digger or something and literally hoiking out the whole bush by its roots. And again, I've seen that be very effective and efficient, provided you turn the bush upside down and you don't allow it to reroot. That's quite important. And of course, if you do that, you're using almost no herbicide because there's very little regrowth. So it can be quite slow and expensive, but on the other hand, you're not using very much herbicide. In ancient woodland sites, I'm not absolutely sure that's the right way to go, because of course that amounts to a colossal amount of disturbance. You know, if you're doing 1 or 2 bushes, that's fine, but if you're doing acres and acres of it, you're sort of ripping up an awful lot of soil and seed bank. Might be beneficial, may not sure about that. It'd be good to have a discussion on that. And where you've got very small seedlings, you can just pull them up, and the layerings come up very easily as well. But I bet you anything you like, if you come across anything that's more than 2 feet tall, you think, oh, I'll have that out, and you're walking past and you try and pull it out and it doesn't come up. So just a few photos then, quickly, just to illustrate a few points. This is an ancient woodland site in central Lancashire. In fact, if you look left, you can see this as you're going south down the M6. You can see this just before you get to Garstang. And we've now controlled this site, but you can see what I mean about not being able to get into the wood. We wanted to thin this wood and we knew it needed a thinning, but you just couldn't get in there to even mark the trees, let alone send somebody in to do any felling. This was another case in point where you couldn't get into the site. And in fact, the contractor who won this job had a look at the site, gave us a price, and we thought, great, that sounds good value. And he started work, got halfway through the site and said, I've made a horrible mistake here. I can't finish this job for the price. So that was embarrassing all round. And the reason that happened was because he couldn't get into the site physically, and he just couldn't appreciate how dense the rhododendron was and what a lot of work it was. He's also quite fastidious, and you see how clean the site is. So he had enormous bonfires to make the site nice and clean, which added a lot to the cost. And the site was just far bigger than he thought, and that is it cleared. We had to come to an agreement with the landowner to go back and revisit the prices so that nobody lost out. But it was a very delicate situation to deal with. And in that particular case, the rhododendron was spreading onto a neighbouring SSSI, which is that site there, believe it or not, with a young and very open larchwood on it. And even on the SSSI, we were allowed to go back and spray the regrowth with Roundup at the appropriate mixture. And a lot of people say that Roundup doesn't work, and they say, oh yes, I use double the dose, or it's best to mix it with diesel or old engine oil, or you know, all these tales about what to do with Roundup. But the enormous multi-billion-pound company, I can't remember who it is that makes Roundup, probably didn't use old engine oil as part of the mixture. They would have spent an awful lot of time coming up with the right concentration. So The top tip with treating rhododendron regrowth with herbicide is to read the label and apply it as it says on the label. And quite often, if you do that, you'll kill it in 1 year. Some people leave the regrowth for a season and treat it in the second season, which is what we've done here. And because the leaf area is much greater, you get a more efficient kill because the Roundup is drawn down, the glyphosate is drawn down into the roots. And it's a systemic herbicide, so you get a much better kill rate. Another tricky site near Hawkshead. This became quite a dangerous site really, because this is quite big rhododendron. It couldn't really be done by hand, so the contractor went in with a chainsaw, and you can see it's on the edge of the lake, which was quite boggy, very difficult to keep your footing. The rhododendron doesn't seem to mind growing in these really boggy conditions, despite where its native range is. So you've really got to think very carefully about risk assessments here. What happens if your chainsaw operator loses his footing in the lake? All sorts of horrible potential complications. Some of this stuff can be really big and dense. This was a tiny little site with some of the biggest rhododendron you've ever seen. And we have a contractor here who cut it all off using a chainsaw, and amazingly using his gang, managed to get it into rows. I couldn't really get a good shot of it, but he managed to make piles and rows so that he left most of the stumps exposed, so that when it regrew, he could come back and treat it with herbicide. And the piles of brash were so big that there was no chance of it growing back again. This was another wet site. This is near the A590 in South Cumbria. Again, a very publicly visible site with not wall-to-wall rhododendron, but where it had got established, it was phenomenally dense. We asked a contractor to look at it, and he said, yeah, I can do that. And here he's made a really good job. You can see that he's used a little mobile chipper. And I'll tell you why he used a chipper in a slide or two, but it's made a very effective and efficient job of getting rid of most of the brash. There's a few bits and bobs left that they couldn't get through the chipper, but I was very pleased with that. And there's the machine. Quite a lot of chips. And, you know, in an ancient wooden site, you wouldn't really want 2 feet of chips covering the woodland floor. But I think in this case, the damage had already been done to the seed bank by decades of rhododendron growth anyway. Before using that chipper on this site, the contractor said he could do it with a flail, and I thought it was ideal for a flail. It was quite wet, but it was very flat. And he spent a day with a flail, and you can see the result there. It isn't very pretty, but my goodness me, it's very effective. Until he came across a particularly wet spot when it suddenly became a bit less effective. I understand that he was panicking because he thought he'd lose his £40,000 machine completely. So he did some phoning around. This is late on a Friday afternoon, and he found somebody with an enormous crane to pull the machine out, and it cost £1,000 to hire the crane to get the machine out. And you can see the state of it afterwards. So it had to be completely stripped down, which cost him another £1,000 to have his machine repaired and put back right. So he didn't charge the owner for that, and he did eventually finish the job. But it just goes to show that, again, the contractor had visited the site and he told us he could do it. But he went there at the end of a dry spell a week after it started raining and nearly lost his machine in the bog. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope that was interesting and useful, and it just made you think a bit about some of the techniques and some of your own sites. And yeah, let's have some debate and some questions. Do I need to hand back over to you, Claire?
Can do, yeah. Thanks very much, Edward. That's marvellous introduction and a bit of some practical experience as well applied in the area. But I guess the themes don't really change too much. Has anyone, I guess folks are here for all sorts of different reasons, woodland owners, maybe contractors. Does anyone have any questions for Edward or want to share any specific experiences with rhododendron clearance? If you just press unmute and shout out or put something in the chat. Thinking about what we've seen so far, different hosts of Ramorum. There's obviously different types of Phytophthora, but we're talking about Phytophthora ramorum here. Neville and somebody called Philip have been talking about beech as a host. Apparently beech trees may be the terminal host tree, so don't go on to sporulate and infect from beech. May or may not be unusual. Yeah, interesting stuff about the honey, toxic honey. Okay, so we've got a question from Liam. Hi, Liam. Liam Plummet, formerly of National Trust, now of Woodland Trust in Sheffield. He is asking, Edward, have you or anyone else had any experiences of the lever and mulch method of control? Anyone heard of lever and mulch? Thanks, Liam.
You might have to explain a bit more, Liam. I'm not sure what that means.
Are you comfortable, Liam, unmuting yourself and chatting?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I was finishing a curry, so I thought it was good to have a video on. Lever and mulch, I don't know much about it, but I believe it's a method in Scotland and it involves some unusual it's sort of almost like hedge laying from what I understand, but I don't know enough about it, so I'd be interested if anyone on the call has seen it. I think it originated in Torridon or somewhere way up north, maybe Knoydart, and apparently a few people swear by it, so I was just curious.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that means. I mean, maybe levering it literally means levering it out of the ground. Perhaps this is the same as winching and hoiking it out of the ground and then chipping up the resulting brash.
Right. I don't think it's winched. I've got a feeling you cut certain ways, and yeah, it's hard to explain. I think if you look online, there is a video of some guys doing it, but I was just curious to know how effective it is and also how efficient, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's worth researching, isn't it? If they think it's effective. Yeah.
Jamie's chipped in. He says that he's seen it, Liam, in Scotland, and it does work, but only on smaller bushes. Keep it a bit and then pull it out. It does disturb the soil though. So, but a bit of soil disturbance is all right, I think.
Yeah.
Liam, do you want to ask yours? Go on, Edward.
I was just going to say, you know, when you've got bushes that are really actively spreading sort of through an open woodland, you know, and it's starting to loop and root and loop and root, you can pull up 2 or 3 stages by hand, literally. It's fantastic for volunteers, and you can just pull them up, and it's quite brittle wood. And if you get on the sort of inside the bush and pull it up from the inside, you can pull up 2 or 3 of these loops, and then it just snaps off, and you chuck it onto the heap, roots up to the air.
The flailing example, how long ago was that? Edward Liam's asked about ground floor recovery since flailing.
Only this is only its 2nd summer, so I haven't really been back to have a look. I have to say, I think it's very soon to find out how effective that's been.
Thank you.
Cheers, Liam. Philip's asked a question about the Ponticon. What have we got here? Is it a pure species or is it some hybrid of other introductions? I have extensive knowledge on this because I watched Gardener's World on Friday, where they did a repeat, another repeat because of COVID, about hybridization of Rhododendron Ponticon. And yeah, I think that could be quite an involved question. Do you know anything about that, Edward?
No, I've not really. Apparently there is some people are calling a potential hybrid super ponticum, aren't they? I think I've read, but you know, I'm not convinced that's very meaningful. To be honest, it doesn't matter whether it's a hybrid or not, because the ordinary stuff seems to spread and spread and spread, and we know it's a host for Phytophthora. So, you know, I do have quite a few clients where this has been planted in the woodlands, but the woodlands go right up to the gardens around the house, and you find all sorts of beautiful azaleas and white rhododendrons and pinks and reds, and you know, those are sort of part of the history of the garden and the house and the setting of those things. So we don't go hell for leather cutting every rhododendron species down. It's quite useful to take photographs when they're in flower around this time of year, and then go back and target what you know is the Rhododendron Ponticon, the invasive one, in the winter. I don't think the others spread in that invasive way like Ponticon. Sorry, off the subject, but I don't really know about the hybrids, I have to say.
Philip, do you want to shout up? Does that answer your question? Is that sort of along the lines you were thinking about? Anybody else got any questions or points for discussion? Here we go. We've got hands up. I like this bit of order. Okay, we've got Phil Graves. Would you like to unmute yourself? And then after that, we've got Angus.
Yeah, can you hear me? In fact, my colleague knows far more about it than I do. I think she's on this. Maggie should be on this webinar. I think I saw her name. And one of the things that she's introduced here, and it's outside Glasgow in Mugdock Country Park, she's been drilling holes in the big trunks before putting the I presume it's Roundup. And that seems to have made quite a difference. Is that something that you've tried, Edward, putting it in holes in the trunks?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's something that I omitted to put on my list. I must add that, and that's a perfectly valid and recognised technique, and saves mucking about with the chainsaw. I think that will be okay on a modest infestation, but please correct me if I'm wrong, and your colleague Maggie, correct me if I'm wrong. I think if you had to do it on acres and acres, your contractors crawling around on their hands and knees would pretty soon go home. So yeah, I don't know. Perfectly good way of doing it.
The other point I was going to make, more of a point, as a volunteer, what is extraordinarily depressing is if you've done a few days or an afternoon clearing an area, and basically what you've ended up doing is coppicing it, because you come back 2 or 3 years later and nothing's been done as a follow-up, and that can be extraordinarily demoralizing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I've had to go back to sites where the owner has said, don't worry, I'll keep it under control, and it's just not happened. So I agree. And I've just had some rhododendron pulled up and cut by volunteers in my own bit of woodland. And I have written myself on the top of my to-do things is to organise a contractor to go back and spray it.
Good. Okay, that's me.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Phil. That's great. Angus, would you like to come in?
Yeah, mine's maybe a bit of a silly question. But are there any commercial applications of rhododendron brash and logs at the minute? I know obviously chipwood and biomass is getting more and more valuable as time goes on. And has anyone ever done it for break even or anything like that? Or any thoughts on that, Edward?
That's a perfectly valid question, a really good question actually. I thought about putting it in my presentation, but I thought I'd make it a bit too long. I have sold some rhododendron brash for biomass, but it had been lying in the hot summer sun for a year, so all the leaves had dropped off. You know, one of the problems with fresh rhododendron is that it's covered in lots and lots of leaf matter, and the biomass people won't want that. So it's got to be dry and without the leaves, and the contractor took it away at cost, really. So there was no income for the owner, but the owner did get a clean site. You know, you need, it makes, a rhododendron makes a pretty good firewood, but it's never straight. You'll never cut it, you never sell it commercially as firewood because it's never in long enough bits or big enough bits, and it's always bent. So by all means, load up your pickup with it. It's quite, I think it's got quite a good calorific value, but I don't think you'd ever sell it to a commercial firewood person. Years and years ago, there was a question about can you make charcoal out of rhododendron, and people were really worried about, well, what happens if you cook your food on a rhododendron charcoal barbecue? You know, surely you're going to get poisoned. But of course, people forgot that charcoal is charcoal, it's pure carbon, and all the horrible toxins have been driven off before you cook your food on it.
Thanks, Edward. Thanks, Angus. Does that answer your question? Oh, Jamie's piped up to say that he is apparently still alive, having made charcoal from rhododendrons. That's good news. We did have a conversation about whether Phytophthora ramorum was present in the smoke from burning larch, making charcoal from larch. But I have absolutely no scientific references for you there at all. Julian, I can see your hands up, and also I've got 2 more questions in the chat. Can I do a chat question, Julian? Then I'll come to you. Somebody called John has heard instances where other rhodie species have been grafted onto Ponticon rootstock, which may then revert to type. Anyone got any examples of that? I guess that's in a horticultural sort of setting, and then no. Interesting. And then Duncan Davids, you're not going to like this question, Edward. Duncan has asked a bit about herbicides. So how, when, where, and which herbicide to apply, having done some removals and chopping back and some chipping, cutting the stumps.
Yeah, no, that's a perfectly valid question. I have to say I'm not an expert on this, but there's no reason why, to the best of my knowledge, why glyphosate at the right mixture shouldn't work. That's certainly what's in that Forestry Commission practice note, and that's what my contractors use. I suppose the only thing to add to that, well, literally, is that the rhododendron leaves have a waxy cuticle on them. So quite often, if you just put the Roundup at the right mixture on it, it runs off. So you need to add, again, I'm a bit out of date. It always used to be called mixture B, but you need to add a surfactant to get the herbicide to stick to the leaves so that the poison is taken in by the plant. And the other thing to make, obviously, the instructions are not to apply the herbicide if it's going to rain within 24 hours, because it just gets washed away. So I've not really answered your question there. That's
almost, yeah. I think I've already chopped and chipped a lot of it, so the leaves are already covered and dealt with. It's more what should I do to the stumps, really, that I'm looking for. Is it worth putting herbicide on those? Do I wait for a year?
How long has it been cut?
About 12 hours.
Yeah, well, I think that the recommendation is that you treat it straight away.
Right.
So,
right, yeah.
Yeah, have a cup of tea and go and do it.
yeah, maybe in the morning, but yeah, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Duncan. Cheers for the question. Julian, would you like to come in?
Yeah, just a general question, really. But how many years does it take if you've had sort of high infestation of rhododendron, you've completely cleared it? How many years to get health back into the ground?
Yeah, that's a spot-on question, and a really good question. I cast my mind back to the rhododendron that I cleared sort of longest ago, and I can see it now. It was in Chapel House Woods in South Lakes, and that must be at least 15 years ago. And to this day, there is almost nothing growing there. Now, that might be because there's too much shade. I think that's part of the reason. And I think one of the possible advantages to a little bit of ground disturbance is that, you know, it does mix up the leaf litter. It exposes the seed bank. you might expose some mineral soil that's not been badly affected by the rhododendron for foxgloves and birch seeds to blow in and germinate. So I think that's one of the advantages to pulling the stuff up and getting lots of volunteers walking around the site, is that it disturbs the ground. And I think that would be the best thing to do to try and get a quick recovery. But if you don't do anything, it could be a long time, long wait, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Julian. Duncan said that he's been advised poor to moderate ground, 10-year recovery, poor to fairly good ground, 15 years. So it's not quite tree time, but it's getting that way. Have you got, with that in mind, Edward, have you got any success stories? Have we had time to have any success stories yet? That's
a good question. I think this is the time when it makes you think, and I sometimes think, oh yes, I remember doing some work on that estate, but that was 10 years ago. I should go back and have a look. But that was when I was with Cumbria Woodlands, and I don't have the contact anymore. So you kind of need this sort of long-term view, really, which very few agents or estates can give. So I can't give that long-term success story, I'm afraid. Not really.
We'll just have to start collecting those stories then for when we all write our books.
Yes, please. I think you should. Yeah.
Okay.
The key thing is to make, as somebody said, is to make sure that you organise the spraying before you forget about it, or before the owner says, "Oh, I didn't put any money aside for that. You should tell me I should budget for it." You know, the key thing is to get it organised soon and be persistent, because sometimes it'll take 2 or 3 or 4 years for the contractor to go back and find every last little bit.
Okay, thanks, Edward. Jamie, are you available? Just ignore me if you're not available, but I just wondered if you had any examples of successful sites that you'd visited. No, you may be holding the baby. Okay, Philip says, I read somewhere that lichens and moss covered the bare ground and prevented seed spread. Suggested to scarify the ground to clear this covering away. I'm not sure I would go with interfering with the bryophytes in that way, but each to their own. I suppose it depends about what your objectives are for the woodland and the management.
I think that's, in some ways, you could envisage that if the ground is quite mossy, these seeds, although there are a lot of them, they're very light, aren't they? And perhaps they could just sit in the top layer of moss, and I don't know how long they're viable for. If they're only viable for a year, then perhaps the rhododendron seeds, won't stay there for very long, and clearing them away will do what I suggested earlier on, and it'll allow more mineral soil for other plants to come in quickly. But I take your point about not disturbing anything that's too rare and uncommon.
That would assume we could identify it, though, Edward.
Oh, indeed. Yes. Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah. Anyone else got any contributions or questions? Okay. Well, I think we'll finish there. And one more. Phil Graves. So Phil said 2 to 3 years of annual herbicide treatment to kill a small patch of rhododendron next to their house, and he has suggested 10 to 15 years before the ground recovered. So yeah, it's a serious commitment, isn't it, really, for the landowner? Yeah. Thanks very much for coming, everybody. It's really good to see you all. And this is going to be the last in our spring series of webinars, because it might be that you want to be out in the woods of an evening. And then we'll probably get back together in the autumn for some more evening webinars. So feel free to get in touch to suggest any topics that you're interested in having covered, or speakers. I think it's good to have these chats about woodland restoration and get the support and the information. All of this has been funded by the Woodland Trust. and we've been doing years of restoration with the Woodland Trust. But it would be Cumbria Woodlands who would visit you. Sign up to our newsletter, follow us on social media if that's your bag, and thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
You're welcome.
Thanks very much. Much appreciated.